Before I start, let me just say this. I know it sounds cliche, but a girl on a lonely road has a breakdown, gets out of the car and sees something weird or spooky, right? But I can't help that this happened to me. All I have is this experience now, and I have to live with it. Look, cliches don't leave paws or huge jagged scratch marks down the side of your car either. Cliches don't do that. Unknown animals or monsters do. In fact, 2 years ago, I was on my way to my parents' house from my boyfriend's place. These days, we live together downtown, but at the time, our parents lived in neighboring towns in the hills above Boulder, Colorado. We'd spent the day at his parents', but since I was supposed to be spending the weekend with my family, I was making the late drive back over the hills to home. Now, if you don't know about it, Peak to Peak Highway can be a creepy place to be at night. I'm telling you now, if you're an out-of-towner, don't go there. So, you come out of town and start winding through what is basically a very windy road, even though it's built right through and around the mountains. The further you go, the less civilization there is, until you eventually end up on this lonely road, with forest on either side and no real streetlights. So there I am, driving along in my little car, singing along to the radio, when suddenly the radio cuts out, the headlights switch off, and the dashboard now goes black. It was all I could do to stop myself from having a heart attack. Why they decide to not illuminate basically the darkest part of the entire trip is well beyond me. Possibly the county didn't have the money, but I don't know. But, judging by the fact that there was literally nobody else driving the route that night, I guess there really isn't a demand. I was on a fairly straight portion of the road and was able to just kind of let it roll to a stop. If I had been on a bend, and there had been something coming the other way, it could have ended very badly, because I would not have been able to see where I was going, thinking that it must be some sort of electrical problem. I got out of the car, popped the hood. Now, I was no mechanic, but I did have a strong suspicion of what was wrong. It happened once before, and my dad had to show me what to pull and to twist to make the darn thing work again. So, might as well have brought a wrench and beat on the engine to get it to start back up. So, here I am, on my own in front of my own car. I had my cell phone, and I was using that as the only form of light I had. It was pressed between my teeth, and I hear a noise behind me. A noise I don't quite recognize. So, naturally, I freeze. I stopped what I was doing, using the phone like a searchlight, scanning all across the trees. And further up the road, I thought the sound had come from this area, but nothing. Just the darkness and a few leaves moving in the breeze. I told myself it was probably just the wind, and went back to what I was doing. After some more carefully directed pulling and twisting, putting the hood down, as I did, I caught sight of the most terrifying reflection in the windshield. A creature with deep, sunken-in yellow eyes stared out in the dark behind me. So I slammed the door, fumbled the keys into the ignition as quickly as I could. I kept turning and turning it over and over in a desperate attempt to get this thing to work. And eventually, I turned to my right, and I saw what I can only describe as a monster. It looked something like a wolf, or a dog or something, but it appeared to have the body of a man. It was staring into the window of the car, its longer snout opening, and showing its terrible, murderous teeth. I think one of the scariest memories is this didn't have teeth like a dog. They reminded me of a reptile or a shark, just out of place and jagged, and sticking out of its mouth. These teeth did not belong in the mouth of this animal. You know, people have tried to tell me it was a bear, and trust me, I seldom tell this story to anybody. But I know what a bear looks like. Bears are very distinctive looking. The head of this thing was the wrong shape. The whole thing was wrong. Okay, it wasn't a bear. It was some kind of hybrid thing. I know that's crazy, but it looked exactly like a man and a coyote or a wolf. I remember its ears very distinctly, jutting upwards on the top of its head. It looked very canine, nothing like a bear. Finally, I don't know if it was the grace of God or what, but the car burst into life, the headlights flooding, and an instant later, I was hurtling away, leaving behind whatever this animal or predator was behind me in the darkness where it belongs. Unfortunately, I'll never get this out of my head. And luckily, we do live in town now. I've never taken that highway since. But that does not take back the countless nightmares I've had of this predator that walks around in the woods at night. And I thought monsters weren't real. And I thought horror stories and horror movies were not based on reality. But this whole thing has made me reevaluate my life. Reevaluate what we really do consider reality. I was driving home from a work event late one night when this huge storm hit. I was out on a small back road, still 20 miles outside of the city. It was pitch black out there, and at this time of night, there was almost zero traffic. The rain was bad enough that I could not see, but then the hell began, and I knew I needed to get somewhere safe. If it were just the rain, I probably could have parked on the side of the road and waited it out, but there was lightning and terrible wind. I was worried about a tree falling on the car with me in it, or getting washed into a ditch upside down. And my dad was an EMT, and I'd heard lots of horror stories. He made sure I knew how to keep myself safe in any sort of emergency situation. I had a flashlight in my glove box, and I slowed down, looked around outside, trying to spot shelter of any kind. I saw what looked like a barn set back in the woods, just up the road. I decided to try and wait it out, get the storm out of the way. I parked the car, leaving the flashes on so nobody would hit it, then ran for the barn. When I got there, I realized it was not a barn at all, but actually an old abandoned house. It was in rough shape, but it was mostly dry, and the shelter from any storm would have been suffice. Besides, it was in a clearing and made of wood, so it was probably pretty fail-safe from lightning, right? The door was locked, but the window was broken, so I climbed through. There didn't appear to be any glass. I wasn't worried about getting cut. I found a dry spot in a closed stairwell, away from the windows, and sat and waited for the storm to pass. I understand you probably think it's strange that I went out of my way to do this, but I guess maybe you'll understand once I get to the end of the story. I didn't want to be stuck in the creepy house all night. And finally, the wind had died down, and I hadn't seen lightning or had heard thunder in quite a while. So I assumed the worst had passed. I looked outside, and it still appeared to be raining, but not quite as hard as it was. I climbed back out the window, made a run for my car. I was sliding around in the mud and had to keep my eyes on the ground. When I get close to my car, I skidded to a stop, nearly falling. A human figure was standing at my car, by the driver's side, looking in. I could only see the dark shape, but no real discernible details. Between the dark and steady rain, I could not see more than a few feet. After my heart had stopped pounding, I realized that it was probably another concerned driver, or maybe even a police officer. I took a few steps closer, yelling hello, but there was no answer. The shape in my car shifted, and then walked around behind my car. It moved oddly, hunched over, and walking with a bizarre cadence. I still could not see much. I remembered my flashlight, lifting it, pointing the beam at the shape. I can now see this creature clearly, and I lost it. It was a monster, not a human at all. I'd only had a glimpse of this furry face and long teeth before it ran on 2 feet, out of the path of my flashlight. It ran into the woods when my light hit it, so I ran towards my car, fumbling with my keys. I made a wide circle around the car, keeping my eyes on where it had to run to. I was nearly panicking, desperate to get into my car and get out of there. I dropped my keys again, and my hands were so wet. But on the next try, I was successful in opening the car, diving inside and slamming the door shut, locking on the doors. I looked around, making sure this thing that I saw wasn't near, and I pulled out of there as quickly as I could. But that's not all of it. The rain was still coming down very hard, and it forced me to go slower than I wanted to. It was good though, because when something jumped out in front of my car, I would just slide into it. Despite only going about 30 miles an hour, my brakes had skid on the wet road. I put the car in park, jumped out, convinced I'd actually hit something. I ran to the front of the car and looked down. There was nothing there, but in the headlights, I could see a smear of blood. A thick tuft of fur stuck in the grill of my car, my stomach dropping, and I ran back inside the car. As I pulled away a second time, I saw something shining at me, coming from the trees. As I pulled away a second time, I saw something shining at me, coming from the trees. A pair of eyes, glowing eyes, set in a dog-like face. It was the monster I'd just seen, a canine creature running on 2 legs, and I guess I'd hit it with the car. I was so scared I couldn't process it all, and peeled out of there, no longer caring about the rain or what I could have done to my car. By some miracle, I had made it home alive. The next day, when I went out to look at my car, there was an actual dent on the hood, and fur, and the blood on the grill and bumper. I called my father over. When he saw the damage, he'd asked if I'd hit a bear, and I told him no. So I tried to describe the thing that I had hit. He insisted that it was dark and raining hard, and that I'd hit a bear, and just could not see it well. But I'll never forget those glowing eyes, or the sharp teeth and the weirdly human dog face. It's strange how, when I tell people what I saw, they usually backfire with some sort of explanation. Well, it was probably this, or it might have been that. I mean, they all do it. Everybody has a suggestion of what I might have seen or what I probably saw. They never let themselves consider what I saw. It might actually just be what it is that I saw. You know, it makes me laugh, because they say it quickly. Like no sooner have I said the words, and they fire back with these theories that just don't make sense. It's almost like a reflex muscle they just can't help. Like their brains say, no, this challenges the norm, everything we know. This can't be true. Those things aren't real. But I saw what I saw. And I saw it as plainly as I see my hand before my face. What I saw was solid. It was there, it was in the physical realm, and made no attempt to explain it away. You're not going to convince me otherwise. Let me kind of tell you now what exactly had happened. I had been at the fairground back in June of 2016. They set up the rides and booths on Markham's fields about twice a year. You always know it's coming because you'll see flyers plastered all over town. Anyway, I always love these local fairs, and in particular, the rides. I don't know about you, but there's something about the fact that a ride wasn't there a week ago, that it's been unloaded from the back of someone's truck, and put together with a screwdriver and a monkey wrench. It really just makes it 10 times scarier than the rides you get at Six Flags or even Disney World. It gives them this added element of danger. That, in addition to the speed and movement of the rides, they might not have been put together that well. Of course, you very rarely ever hear of anyone actually being hurt. If that's true, they'd be shut down, and I'm sure there are all kinds of safety checks. Anyway, last June, like I said, a few friends and I headed down to the fair. After a lot of needling, we managed to convince Donna, whose real name I won't use, but she hates these kind of rides. We got her to go on something called the Kraken. Now, let me explain something. The Kraken is this huge 8-armed contraption. You sit on one carriage with 4 other people. The ride has a total of 8, and each at the end of one of the mechanical arms. They all go lift into the air, and the entire thing spins. There were 4 of us, and only 3 spaces left. I let Donna and the others get into one, so I go into one by myself. I'm partly pleased because the weight of these tend to spin faster and give you a better ride. If you've ever been to any amusement park, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Once the ride began, just as we were being lifted up into the air, I happened to glance toward the tree line, and I swear I saw something. It appeared to be standing, hunched against one of the trees and watching the crowd. I'd seen nature documentaries where you see wolves or lions standing at the edge of the brush, using the trees as camouflage. That look on their face as they're observing, strategizing, preparing to pounce. This was almost an identical situation. This animal wasn't just watching out of curiosity, but it was planning, selecting, weighing up its next move. It appeared to be, even from the distance I was from it, far bigger than any man or ape that I had ever seen. And judging by the size of the trees, I'd say it was easily between 7 or 8 feet tall. It was standing up on its hind legs, like a person would, but with this sort of backward lean, as if the hips were different than ours. From the glimpses I got, it seemed to be hunched, and it was not a person. I think the best way I could describe it would be some sort of cross between a dog and a man, or the kind of creature you see in horror movie films, like a werewolf, but not exactly a werewolf. It's as if the head was of some massive wolf, and had just been slapped on the shoulders of some large man. It appeared to be covered in this dark, light fur. Different patterns, but you could tell from the way it was built. It seemed very powerful, ready to leap out and grab anybody. I was screaming, but so was everybody else, because of the ride. I began pointing frantically at the trees, trying to get somebody's attention. Either this was the most elaborate prank I'd ever seen, or this was about to get deadly. Soon enough, I was facing away from the tree line, and trying my best against the G-force to turn into my seat, to look back over my shoulder and to see it again. All I saw were quick flashes of it, tiny snatched glimpses, and by the time the ride was finished, this animal or creature was now gone. I kept scanning the trees to try and see it again, and show it to the other. I tried to explain to them how it looked, how it had canine-like appearances, like a muscular body, and a very dog-like head, but it also appeared to have very human-like features. Anyway, all I got back was quick-fire explanations. They suggested I was hallucinating, making it up, or just happened to see something that really wasn't there. But I tell you what, if werewolves are really existent, then that was the most realistic one I've ever seen. I know what I saw. It did not appear to be a person in a costume either. There's no reason for it. Why would somebody randomly be at the tree line, and that somebody be in an easily $3,000 costume, and to also be around 7 or 8 feet tall? I'll tell you what though, it freaked me out so much that sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still see it. I can't get it out of my head, how it's something that just shouldn't exist. But it does. I would love to see if you have any answers on this. This was around May in 2013. I got my first real girlfriend at the age of 17. I'll never forget her name, Caitlin. We had been dating for a few months, off and on, and were at the point where we were always trying to find places to sneak away, for privacy's sake. I mean, both of our parents were pretty strict about not having closed doors, etc. You know how parents are. It forced us to get creative. Eventually, I remembered that there was this old farm next to my aunt's house across town. I had played there a few times as a kid and knew there was an empty barn on the property. I was pretty sure that it wasn't even being used anymore. Just our luck, right? Well, I talked to Caitlin and she was down. One Friday night, we decided to go check it out. We told our parents that we're going out to dinner and a movie. But instead, we got takeout, drove out to my aunt's house, parked down the street, and cut through her yard. I even brought a lantern. Old school, I know, but you use what you can use. I also took a few blankets for a picnic, and possibly other things. My aunt lived at the very edge of town, and her property and the farm door next door were bordered by a decent-sized forest. It was all privated land. I was relieved to see that the barn was still there, and did not look like it was falling down. So, after a few tries, I was able to pry open the door successfully. I turned on the lantern, looking around. Yeah, it was pretty rustic for sure, but at least it was dry, and most importantly, private. It smelled a little musty, but was otherwise fine. We picked a spot in the far corner, set up our blankets, and then our dinner. We had just finished our meal when we had heard a noise. It was a faint scratching sound. We bolted up, looking around. I did not want to tell Caitlin that there were probably rats here in the barn, although that was my best guess. So I told her it was likely stray cats. But when we heard the sound again, it was coming from outside the barn, and it sounded large, very big, not a rat or a cat. So I got up with the lantern, peeked between the gaps in the wood slates. I didn't see anything, so I went back. The third time the scratching came, it appeared right behind us, and much louder. Caitlin screamed and demanded that we leave now. I wasn't ready to give up on our little hideout, so I offered to go outside and look, using my phone flashlight, opening the barn door just enough to slip out. I walked all around the perimeter of the building, but didn't see anything, at least until I actually looked at the walls. There were these huge scratch marks all the way down into the wood, including the corner where we had been sitting at. The marks were very deep, concerning, and most horrifying. They looked fresh. So I ran back into the barn and told Caitlin. We weren't sure what to do. If something was out there, like a bear, we had a long walk out in the open before we got back to anyone's car. But we felt relatively safe here in the barn, since I could always just latch the door. I mean, unless we had a big slab of food, I really don't think any bears were going to be trying breaking in. We tried to figure out what might have made those marks. It was something bigger than a cat, that was for sure. The most likely answer was possibly a stray dog. It had smelt our dinner, and probably just wanted some. But you know, in this part of Indiana, we also had bobcats. That was always a possibility. So we waited a few minutes to see if we could hear the animal again. We decided if we didn't hear anything for more than 5 minutes, we would make a run for it. At 4.5 minutes, something began banging against the door. We both screamed, and then it rattled. then moved around the building, testing the walls. At that point, we were scared enough to call for help, even if that meant getting grounded for sneaking out there. Caitlin suggested her older brother. He would not tell her parents, and he was home from college for the weekend to do errands and laundry. She asked him to bring a weapon, gave him directions. Although it would take him a good 20 minutes just to get out to us, though. Was it worth it? We climbed up top a built-in cabinet and stayed put and quiet, hoping this animal would eventually go away. There was a small hole in the wood near us, and so I pressed my eye to it, watching, looking around to see if I can see anything. Up on the cabinet, I was nearly about 7 feet off the ground, so when an eyeball looked back at me, I just about had a heart attack. I scrambled, freaked out, nearly falling. The eye looked orangish and yellowish, like an animal. I freaked out, yelling nonsense at Caitlin, who was now crying. I understand that this part of the story probably sounds ridiculous, and I get that. But I can't take back the fear that I felt. So I grab her, pulled her to the other side of the barn, inside a much older horse stall. I tried to explain to her what I had seen, but she just could not understand. She looked half like she didn't believe me, half petrified because of the look on my face. We stood in the corner, huddled together. There was a small gap between the boards on the outer wall there, too. I stayed away from it, having learned my lesson, but kept glancing at it. Sure enough, I soon saw a shape moving past the gap. It appeared tall, but was confirming that it was indeed the source of whatever eye I had seen, and it appeared to be looking for us. I had no idea how it could be so tall. I mean, not even a human could be that tall. I was sure the eye wasn't human, but maybe I was wrong. On the next pass, I see a flash of hair, and I knew I was right. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs, and it somehow smelled food. I mean, I'm positive it wasn't human. So I leaned forward a little, despite Caitlin's trying to pull me back. And just in that moment, this hairy hand reaches through the gap, curling its long claws right around the wood, making every attempt possible to pull it off. That's when everything went haywire. We run out of the stall, standing in the middle of the barn, trying not to hyperventilate and pass out from sheer terror. Luckily, just then, we heard her brother calling for us. So we run towards the door, flung it open, knocking right into him. He was holding a baseball bat and looking very confused. I was about to tell him he needed to run, when we all heard the growling sound. There, by the barn, appeared to be this animal, or our stalker. The tallest animal I've ever seen, and it was standing on 2 legs. Its face was like that of a dog, kind of like a Doberman Pinscher, actually. Very sharp teeth, kind of orangey amber eyes, and it was staring at us, slowly backing and forth between us. It looked incredibly strong, full of muscles, and I was mesmerized, half in awe, half in complete terror at what I was looking at. It reminded me of if you took half demon, half man, and then splashed some dog features in there. But I don't know. Then, it raised its head into the air and began sniffing all around, but mainly in the direction of the forest. At the same time, Caitlin's brother hit us both in the back and yells at us to run. We all sprinted for the car, taking a chance and not looking back. Caitlin leaves with her brother, and I speed home faster than I've ever driven on those back roads, which is incredibly dangerous due to how curvy they are, and you gotta watch out for deer. But I don't think any of us cared at this point in time. Our survival instinct was clearly maxed out. So the next day, Caitlin decided to break up with me, and we can never tell anybody why. The winters here in New York are long and dark. I've lived here almost my entire life, so I'm pretty much used to it. But last winter, it felt like it would never end. I think it had something to do with being stuck inside with a very energetic and inquisitive 3-year-old girl and a new baby boy. Oh, and by the way, this happened just before the whole lockdown, right in early March of last year. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love being able to stay home with my babies, but I would definitely say cabin fever had set in pretty bad. It was a pretty nice day, for being early March. The snow at this point was all melted, the sun shining, so I decided to take them for a nice walk right around the neighborhood. I told my daughter to go and find her boots while I was busy putting the baby in the stroller, tucking all the blankets in. My daughter loved walks because she really enjoyed seeing all the animals and dogs in the neighborhood. She didn't care. Big dogs or small dogs. She loved them all the same. I knew she would love to have one, so I figured we'd get one in the next few years. Anyway, it was a great day for being March in upstate New York. And I remember thinking, as we're walking on the sidewalk past our neighbor's house, that maybe I was finally getting the hang of parenting 2 children. It had been a big adjustment, and I knew my daughter needed much more attention than I felt like I had been able to give her at the time. But being happy at the moment, walking along the sidewalk, and just enjoying being a toddler. There were a lot of dogs walking that day, and she was having so much fun. Since we were all enjoying our walk, I thought it would be a great day to go on a longer walk. I mean, the weather was definitely permitting it. So, I decided to turn onto the paved trail on the edge of a wooded preserve, next to our neighborhood. Abby was busy singing Baby Shark, and being such a nice day, I didn't even mind. Then, all of a sudden, she stops and asked, "Is that a cute puppy?" I didn't see anybody on the trail, so I thought she was asking for a puppy, and told her we would probably see one soon. But she wouldn't budge, and kept staring into the woods. Louder, she said it again. "Cute puppy, Mommy, cute puppy." But she didn't sound happy. She was kind of scared. I kept telling her I didn't see a puppy, but I saw she was pointing into the woods. I saw it. It was not a cute puppy. I don't know what it was, but it appeared to be taller than a person. My first thought was I was looking at a bear, but it was standing like a person would, on 2 legs. Or at least that's what I thought, since it was kind of partially blocked by the foliage and the trees, even though in the winter, it's kind of non-existent. But there was enough branches and brush to kind of block any discernible shape. It started walking slowly toward us, and I held my finger to my lips, telling Abby to remain quiet. I'm surprised she listened. Now, my heart was pounding into my chest, and I was trying to plan our escape, when this animal walked into a clearing, and all of us saw it. It appeared to be a dog or wolf of some kind. At least, that's what the head was. But the body appeared to be this giant muscular person, covered in dark fur. I was questioning everything that I thought I knew. Was I looking at a werewolf? I just knew we had to get out of there, and quickly. Just then, out of nowhere, a deer comes running past us, and right past the beast, which immediately took off after the deer, heading away from us. Somebody might as well have ran by with a slab of steak on a stick. I grabbed my daughter's hand, told her to run. As we're running, we heard something like a scream, but it wasn't a human scream. At least, I don't think so. I don't know if it was the deer or this animal. My daughter asked what that was, and asked if it was a big doggy. I told her I didn't know, but everything would be fine. We just had to keep moving. And after that, the rest of the walk is kind of a blur. I barely remember getting us out of there. I tried so hard not to let Abby see how terrified and shaken I was after the encounter with what I later learned could only have been something called a dogman, which apparently there's quite a bit of them here in New York. I know nothing of these animals, and have only barely heard about them. I didn't even think they were a thing, but I guess apparently werewolves are suddenly now real? But when I asked these questions, I found out that these are not werewolves, but something else entirely. Some sort of two-legged walking dog, I guess. Anyway, this was almost a year ago now, and I'm fortunate that this experience didn't alter or disturb my daughter in any way that was permanent. But I'll tell you what though, it's a walk I will never forget. Thank you for hearing my story. In the fall of 1997, a girl had gone missing in my town. At the time, I was only 24, and my brother was a volunteer firefighter. He actually asked me to be part of one of the search parties the town had organized to get together and look for her. We spent days sweeping parks, abandoned lots, and the forests all around town. But as the days passed, the search parties began to narrow and get smaller. But I stayed with it, as did most of the people on the crew. We did secondary sweeps of the deeper forested areas, knowing that she would be harder to find the further out we went. With fewer of us out there, we broke off alone, on solo, but were usually still within yelling distance of one another. And we also had communication, aka walkie-talkies. One afternoon, about an hour or so before dusk, I spotted some weird marks on the ground. I was keeping an eye out for footprints, either child-sized ones or adult ones. That means someone had brought her there. But these tracks were not shoe prints. They appeared to be barefoot, a huge footprint with marks at the toes, almost kind of like claw marks. But the shape was decidedly human, and there were only two prints, meaning it had to have been a person, or something else that walks upright. I mean, what else are we talking here? A gorilla? It couldn't have been an animal. So I called out to another crew member to take a look, and unfortunately, he was just as confused as I. Since we couldn't rule out that they were human, although they were weird, we did follow them. We followed them for what felt like miles, and it was beginning to get late and getting dark. But we did not want to lose the marks overnight, just in case it rained and they washed away or became indiscernible. We radioed for help, got one another person, an older guy. He seemed even less convinced about the footprints, but due to the nature of the missing case, agreed to follow them with us. As dusk came, the footprints got harder and harder to see, even with flashlights, and they were pretty high quality, mind you. We had to slow down and search carefully now. It was starting to seem less and less likely that someone had carried this girl far, but we were not ready to give up on the only lead we'd had so far. While we were stumbling around in the near dark, we started hearing sounds. Someone or something walking, stepping on twigs and dry leaves right around us. We called out, thinking that it might be another member of the search party. Nobody answered, so we swung our flashlights around, but still no one saw. The sounds continued, and I thought about the marks. Whoever left them might still be here with us, and it could be someone dangerous, considering the circumstances. The three of us stood back to back, looking into the forest. I had a small knife with me, and the flashlights were heavy duty, but weren't exactly any kind of weapon. Finally, we saw a shape approaching. It was just a tall shadow, walking towards us, slowly and awkwardly. We called out some more, asking him to identify himself, but he did not answer. As he got closer, I noticed that his shape was all wrong. He was wider than a human, the head being way too big, and he was slightly hunched over, his legs bent backwards, almost like a dog, although he appeared to be walking upright. We pointed all three of our flashlights at what we thought was a person, or maybe a misidentified animal. We could tell pretty quickly that this was not a man, at least any man that we had ever seen. That it almost had certainly made the tracks. Whatever this animal was, it had almost certainly made the tracks that we were currently following, and it appeared to be on 2 feet, bipedally, and was also vaguely human-shaped. But the rest of it appeared to be canid of some kind, especially in the chest and head. It appeared to be covered in long canid fur, a little more stringy than a wolf, but still very much like a long-haired dog. Its face was pointed, and ears very much sticking straight up. Its mouth was open, and we could visibly see saliva dripping from its overabundance of unnatural, sharp teeth. It slowly stepped toward us, never taking its gaze off any of us. In fact, it was so intent, it stared straight into our eyes. The eyes were glowing faintly in the dark. We backed away as it advanced, moving back the way we came. It never changed its pace, neither did we. At least until this thing let out this monstrous howl, and then lunged. That's when we took off running. It took us a long time to get out to the woods. It was dark, we were panicked, so we managed to get lost. Occasionally, one of us would think that we saw this animal, and we'd start running again. It was chaos for that short time. We eventually made our way out, called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, we planned what we would tell them. All we could agree on was that it was some kind of half man or half dog or something. I don't know. One of us mentioned the idea of a werewolf, but it just seemed too ridiculous, and as far as mentioning it to the cops, wouldn't even waste our time. So we had ultimately just planned on saying that we had just followed these human footprints deep into the forest, and that we believed the person whoever took this little girl had made them. The police arrived and agreed to send a team in the following day, following our instructions to where we had lost the footprints. An entire days of search later, they returned, saying they did not find anything suspicious. They didn't say anything about the unknown animal we had witnessed the previous day, nearly trying to attack us. Turns out, 2 days later, the girl that had been missing was found, alive. She had somehow wandered off and got lost. It was a miracle that she was never eaten or attacked by this thing, especially when I think about what it is that we saw. It was so Blair Witch Project-esque. We made some general reports to Animal Control about maybe a wild dog in those woods, but as you can imagine, that request wasn't taken very seriously. But to this day, I can't explain what I saw in there, but I have never gone back in there. I mean, I'm not really a woodsy guy, so I would have no reason to. But just about under no circumstance will I ever go back in there. Story 1. Dogman and the Hay. Back when I was just a little girl, I used to look out my back window all the time, during the morning, afternoon, and even the evening into the night. I loved the landscape of our backyard. We had a huge hay pile, because the old people who used to live there before us had lots of livestock, and for whatever reason, never quite built a barn. Our backyard divoted down into this little flat plain area with lots of trees, and then touched this large forest. While my descriptions aren't exactly exciting, what I saw one evening as a little girl is something I would see that would be reoccurring, that at the time I just thought was a big doggy, even as it stood up on two legs and walked around. The first time I saw it, it was roughly dusk outside, and I just remember seeing this big black doggy walk up right to where the hay is and kind of crouch down, as if it was inspecting something in the hay. It spent quite a bit of time there until it finally left. Of course, at this point, it was only walking around on all fours, kind of like a very, very big wolf. Then, this happened again, in no particular order. It's not like this was a nightly pattern. It was random the days that it would show up, but it was always around the same time, right around sundown, and it would always, for some reason, be attracted to the hay. I'm not sure why. There was nothing in the hay that I was aware of. It's not like my parents were stalking dead chickens in it, so I'm not too sure what that was about. It would always excite me as a little girl, though, because, again, I just thought it was some big doggy, until one day it stood up on two legs and walked all the way around the hay pile, as if it knew something was in there. I thought this was amazing, being only 6 or 7 years old. I wasn't frightened. After circling the hay for a little bit of time and looking through it, it left again. After a few more days go by, maybe weeks, I don't quite remember the time frames, I told my parents about a big black doggy that kept coming to the hay in the evening. My parents both gave me mixed, confused, puzzled faces. They clearly had no idea what I was talking about. I told them, yeah, about every sundown, this dog comes up to the backyard and looks through the hay. They both gave me equally dismissive looks, like they weren't even going to take the time to see what I was talking about. I don't think they ever paid attention, or ever saw what I did. Now that I'm a lot older, and I know about the existence of dogmen and other mysterious cryptids, I'm pretty sure that that is what I saw that night. My sisters never saw it either, so I wonder about that. As far as it looking in the hay, maybe it was stashing food in there. I don't know, but it's very weird to me how it had this strange obsession with the hay and seemed to come to the huge hay pile every few to 4 nights. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is. Story 2. No bathroom breaks. About 2 years ago, during the late fall, I was delivering 2 cords of wood to a lovely family that lives about 45 minutes away from me. To get to their house, I have to drive through very thickly wooded, dense land that probably lasts maybe 20 to 25 minutes. Very windy, curvy roads, very minimal pull-out spots. And wouldn't you know it, about halfway through, I got the urge I had to go to the bathroom really bad. Luckily, it wasn't number 2. So, I came upon one of the only pull-out spots there are, got out, leaving my truck in park and still running, ran over into about maybe 5 or 6 feet of timber, unzipped, and started to relieve myself. As I'm about halfway done, I hear movement coming my direction. Where I'm standing, there's still foliage. Not everything had died off yet, although at this point in the fall, everything was very multicolored, so it still made it hard to see, but I could hear large movement coming toward me. I quickly cut off my stream and got ready to zip back up, when off to my left, right around the tree, the largest wolf face stuck out at me, staring at me with an almost surprised expression on its face. Kind of like a human would. It was an expression like, "What are you doing here?" Of course, me being terrified, nearly stumbled back and ran back into my truck. Didn't even bother looking back. Put it into drive, and I flew out of there so quickly. I'm pretty sure I might have lost a few rounds of wood going so fast. Now, you might ask me, why was I so scared? Well, for the simple fact, the footsteps approaching me originally were that of 2 footsteps, or I guess you call it bipedal. Then, when the largest wolf head stuck its face out at me, this thing was higher up than I was, and staring down at me, from roughly maybe 7 or 8 feet, which means this thing was standing upright, just like a person. And there was something wrong with its face. Even though it did look like a wolf, it looked very human. If you've ever seen American Werewolf in London, that's kind of what it reminded me of. Maybe like somewhere mid-transformation, where the face was still very reminiscent of a human, and fully able to make human expression, but it also was very wolf-like. It was completely unnatural, and terrified me so much that I couldn't help but run. I don't know if you'll ever believe me, but this is just my own personal encounter with something that I can't explain in the deep woods. Story 3. The Howl. This took place just this last January of 2019. I was over at my buddy's house, and we were playing PS4. It was just him and I home, as his parents were at work, and he's an only child. We had just gotten out of high school. We're both 17 and juniors, at least at the time. We were busy playing, and out of nowhere, we both hear this ear-shattering howl, like a wolf, but sounding much bigger, much more distorted and crackly and grainy. We live in the state of Kentucky. To my knowledge, there are no wolves here. I think there used to be, but none. And unless a wolf was directly on the other side of the wall of his house, there's no way a howl could possibly be that loud. It both made us stop and pause the game, and we both at the same time looked in the direction of the howl. As soon as the howl was finished, which, by the way, was more powerful and longer than any howl of a wolf I could have ever imagined, we heard this great crashing sound, like a small tree coming down and crashing. We both jumped up, out off the couch, ran to the back sliding glass door, opened it, and looked out. This was at like 3:45 in the afternoon, so it wasn't dark out at all. It was a little bit overcast, but there was some sun. We saw, off in the distance, at the tip of his very backyard, a tree had fallen, which wouldn't make sense. This tree wasn't dead. It was fully rooted into the ground, and yet, for some reason, it appeared to be like it was torn up and then thrown. I know that sounds incredibly strange and unrealistic, but I'm telling you exactly what we both saw. My friend started freaking out, going, "What happened? What is that?" Not even 30 seconds later, as we're both staring at that uprooted tree from a distance, we hear what sounds like a wolf having a fight with a gorilla. These crazy screaming noises. It was insane. I don't even know how I would recreate them for you, because they were so intense, so loud, so unlike anything I've ever heard before. But it had my friend white as a sheet. Well, not too long after, I left. I was pretty scared. Call me a crappy friend, but I didn't want to be around that. He told his parents when they got home, and they just assumed it was probably the sound of the tree falling out of the ground. Yeah, right. Something was definitely going on back there. Story 4. Visiting the grave. First, let me give you a little bit of background info. My mother, whom I was very, very close with, passed away in late 2005 due to breast cancer. I've been visiting her grave every week since the day she passed. I bring her flowers, spend time talking to her, even though I know she's not really there and dead. It brings me solace and joy and a sense of calm. Just knowing I can be there where her final resting spot is means more to me than I could imagine. For the last 15 years, every week, I've been visiting her grave when I get a chance to. Usually, it's every week, sometimes bi-weekly, until just about a month ago, when I went to take a visit in the evening, bringing her usual flowers, the same kind I know she always loved when she was alive, dahlias. So I got to her grave, set her flowers atop her tombstone, and just began talking to her, just as if she was alive. Sometimes I sob and weep. Other times I feel I can keep it together. It just depends on how I'm feeling that day. Even though 15 years has passed, I still deeply miss her. When I was in, I guess you call it mid-conversation, or maybe mid-thought, I felt something was watching me. So, I figured somebody else was also in this tiny graveyard, which, by the way, has probably less than 30 to 50 graves in it. It's very small, because we grew up and lived in a very small community. I look up, but I don't see anybody else around. I kind of shrugged my shoulders and went back to talking with my mother. That's when the sense of being watched becomes so overpowering. I can't help but look behind me and see this tall figure approaching me from the road. My first thought was that it was somebody in a Halloween costume, because it just didn't look right at first. I stood up and called out, "Who are you? What do you want with me?" And it kept slowly approaching me, walking very slowly. And as the streetlight came on it more, I saw far too many details to realize this wasn't just a person in a Halloween costume. Whatever this was a living, breathing thing. The fur, the rippling muscles, the face, and its glowing eyes all looked far too realistic for this to ever be a person in a costume. Not to mention, the sheer size alone was unrealistic of anybody. This thing had to have been easily 8 or 9 feet tall. I'm talking like the Hulk, except looking like a werewolf, which I hate using that word because it sounds so unbelievable, so unrealistic. But that's exactly what I was looking at. Built like a football player, and as tall as a tree. It had a massive, massive head, with what appeared to be a lion's mane all around its neck and head, down to its chest and back. The front of it was bare and exposed, revealing dark, leathery-like flesh. The face looked very angry, and it almost appeared to have a very dull red glow coming from its eyes. It was walking upright, just like a person would. The only part of this that even resembled a dog was how hairy it was, and the head looked canine. The legs, torso, arms, even the hands. I was beginning to really believe that werewolves existed in that moment. During this entire time, I'm taking the image of this thing in, as it slowly stepped under the spotlight, not even caring how much of it was revealed. I think it wanted me to see it, in some evil, sinister, sick way, because it kept its slow pace towards me, like it was just taking its time, enjoying a short little stroll, and I'll never forget the devious expression written all over its face, like it couldn't wait to get to me. God only knows what it would have done. I fled, in the opposite direction of where my car was, which, unfortunately, was behind whatever this thing was. I've been thinking this now, that this was some sort of demon sent to me to stop me from visiting my mother's grave. How much truth there is to that, I don't know, but I have no way to explain what I saw and why it appeared to only target me. Maybe because there was nobody else around, but it seemed to be drawn to me for some strange reason. That's the only way I can really describe it. I just really feel that deep down. After I ran, I jumped the short fence that was surrounding the cemetery. Don't worry, this wasn't one of the old school tall iron gates with spikes. This was a very short, crappy chain link fence that I was very easily able to climb over. And continuously looking back, this thing had not stopped its pursuit of me, but casually taking its time, as if it had all the time in the world to get to me. Behind the cemetery and where I was running into was very thick little woods. I think if you ran far enough, there was probably a plaid pantry on the other end, of maybe like an acre of woods. I ran through and ended up getting out on the other side to the empty parking lot. This was roughly maybe 6:30 in the evening, so, it being late fall or winter, it was already dark, but business around here had been slow, so unfortunately, there was nobody else to really help me. I sat there and waited, not sure if I should call the police, or maybe talk to somebody to see if they could escort me back. I was starting to break down into hysterics, but also trying to keep myself together. I walked in the plaid pantry and told the clerk at the counter I needed to use the phone. I believe there was somebody chasing me who meant harm. His expression became panicked and offered me the phone. Stupid me, I left my phone in the car because I had only assumed I'd be gone for maybe 10-15 minutes. Well, I called the police and told them that I believed somebody was chasing me and meant to do me harm. An officer showed up pretty quickly, within 10 minutes, asked me a couple of questions, asked me where I was, what I was doing, how far away this cemetery was, and when it came time for him to ask me to describe who I saw, I had to lie outright and tell him I saw a man in a werewolf costume chasing me. Because what was I supposed to tell him? That a real-life wolf creature was coming after me? He would have dismissed any seriousness of my case. So he offered me a ride back to my car. I did, and when I got back there, he decided to have a look around, but of course didn't find anything. I felt safe with his cruiser directly behind my car, so I just stayed put for about 5 or 6 minutes while he checked around real quick. Told me he didn't see anything, and whoever it was clearly gone. He told me to give him a call if I knew anything or saw anything else that was suspicious, handed me his personal card, and we both went our separate ways. That's my encounter story. I don't normally believe in ghosts or anything paranormal or even supernatural, but I really have no way to describe what I saw that night. Before this, I never even gave the concept of demons a thought, but now, that just might very well be a reality that I have to face. Story 5. My 4th of July Nightmare. It was July 4th, 2011, when I spent the 4th of July with my family in rural Kansas, on a very remote section of land. My entire family does this really big get-together, and we have an incredibly sized barbecue. Everybody has drinks, gets rowdy. It's a pretty good time, usually. I was only 15 when this happened. Since all my aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents on both sides get together, things can get pretty crazy. Not family drama. Fortunately, everybody gets along pretty well. But everybody brings their massive haul of fireworks, and we spend about 4 hours lighting stuff off as the day turns to dusk, turns to night. Sometimes, like this night, we'll get in the pickup truck, and my brother, whom at the time was only 19, will drive us around while I'm in the bed and let me shoot off Roman candles and light up sparklers for fun. Normally, it's more than just me, but for this time, it was just me in the bed and my brother driving. That's what we did. We're in a pretty rural location, and we did not have much to worry about when it comes to disturbing neighbors with noise or anything. So we could be as rowdy and loud and boisterous as we want. We went about our merry way. I was in the bed of the truck, shooting off Roman candles at things around me, which, looking back, was incredibly stupid, considering I could have started a massive forest fire. 15-year-old me didn't seem to care, and I had a sparkler in the other hand, with the Roman candle, shooting it out of the bed of the truck. I practically felt like Arnold Schwarzenegger with a Gatling gun, shooting that thing off onto the road. The road we were driving down was a long, straight road. No houses on either side. Maybe just 10 feet of dead grass on both sides of the road, hugged by miles and miles of timber. I wasn't lying when I said we're in a very rural, remote location. The road we were on, I believe, was only used to get to other towns, so there wasn't any other construction around us. I can't recall exactly, but I think there might have been some logging going on. But don't quote me. So, we're driving down, and I'm shooting off a Roman candle, still. I got quite a few with me in the back, because I thought I was so cool. Then, my fun turns into hell in a matter of seconds. At first, I thought it was a bear. It jumps out from the timber on the right side, about 50 feet away from the truck, and onto the road, quickly rising on 2 legs, and full-on sprinting at the truck in an angry haze. I began screaming, which caused my brother to look up and see this thing full-on chasing the truck. Now, he goes from a measly 45 miles an hour to starting to floor it. This thing, then, as smooth as butter, drops down to all fours from 2 and picks up its speed double time. I did the only thing I could think to do: aim my Roman candle at it and shoot it. I landed a few good shots, I think, when this thing stopped, stood up on 2 legs, and made a grunt as it pawed at its face and chest, where I aimed at. It only seemed to make this thing angrier. Now it was pissed, and charged our truck at even faster speeds. It got right up to the bed of the truck, even as my brother was probably pushing more than 80, and this thing jumped from the road into the bed, where I was. The truck almost flipped from the impact of this thing's weight, landing in the bed where I was. Thank God for my brother's driving, who, without hesitating, just reacted by slamming on his brakes before this thing could fully stand up after jumping. And this thing flew over the front of the truck. It was like the thing was catapulted. When I asked my brother, he told me he was doing well over 80, since this road is pretty straight and goes on endlessly for what feels like miles and miles. The halting of the truck threw the thing out, and we skidded, maybe 20 feet, if not more. I don't know how much exactly. I myself was nearly thrown out of the truck, but I was already, my back against the cab, so I didn't really take much of a blow. My brother, without thinking, throws the truck in reverse and does the most impressive, fastest turnaround I have ever seen in my life. Me, in the bed, where this thing had just jumped in. I had fully peed my pants, and I'm crying at this point. Ugly crying. Convinced my brother and I are both going to die by this monster. As my brother is tearing out of there, the thing is now nowhere to be found, since I'm looking directly out of the bed, and now that my brother is reversed, heading back in the opposite direction, I should have full view from where this thing should have landed. But there's nothing. No sign of it. That's probably the only time I've ever seen my brother drive back to the house, pushing 80, quickly, in case this thing started to come back, or maybe burst through the woods. We make it back, and as we start going up the driveway, my brother stops the truck, turns to the back window, pulls it open to talk to me, and says, "Take a minute to clean yourself up. We don't want anybody asking what happened." I did my best to clean my face from crying, but then I had to sneak inside to change my pants. My brother, who kept himself very straight and well together after that, just wasn't the same the rest of the night. Neither of us were. You could tell. He was trying to act like everything was normal. But after that happened, you can't unexperience something like that. My parents were beginning to suspect we were both getting sick, just because we weren't acting normal. I mean, could you blame us? Before I end my story, I'm sure you want to know what we have seen that chased us. Well, it looked like a colossal-sized timber wolf, to be honest with you. When it jumped out onto the road at first, I thought it was a bear. But then it stood up and moved so fast, like a trained killer, that I knew this was something far different. It acted and moved just like a man would. It appeared to have almost astonishing control over its body and each of its limbs, almost like it was a martial artist, and its body was a tool. That is the most disturbing thing to me, if we're honest. It had short fur on the front of it, varying in color, mixing between brown and gray. It had long hair, kind of like a monkey does on its arms. Its hands had huge black claws on each of the ends of its fingers, and its face was kind of like a wolf, except far more distorted and evil-looking, like something you'd see out of a movie. Its snout was more or less shaped like a crocodile or something, longer and more narrow than a typically short and stubby nose of a wolf. It had what looked like too many teeth for its jaws, and they appeared to be razor sharp. Its eyes were tiny, beady, and yellow. You know, even just writing this up tears me up. It's just so scary to think back on. Anyway, I hope you can use my story to warn others about the actual dangers out in the wild. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Story 6. The Drug Deal. Back when I was in college, we, for whatever reason, instead of living on campus, thought it was cheaper to go halvesies on an old piece of crap house, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't too bad. It was only about 30 to 35 minutes from school, which meant that my best friend and I had to get up extra early to make it to class. My best friend wasn't in the best spot in his life. Didn't have a car, didn't have a license, barely could hold a job, but yet I carpooled him around, even when he was a heavy weed smoker, and I had to drive him to his dealer's house nearly every week so he could get his fix. But I did it because I cared about him, and he was like family, even though I probably enabled him through his rough patch. But that's not what this story is about. One day, it was evening, and I was driving him to his dealer's house, which is about an hour away from us, on the opposite end of town. We get there, and I pull up to this person's house. Keep in mind, I don't know his dealer at all. That's just between him and the guy he gets it from. So I'm parked out there. He gets out of the car and goes in the house. I'm sitting there waiting, with the radio on, just chilling, waiting for his precious time to get up so he can come back in the car. It had been like 15 minutes at this point, when in front of me, I see something moving. I thought it was a dog at first glance, but then it turned to face me and saw that it wasn't a dog. It looked like some sort of horribly mutated hyena. It was very ugly, black and brown, had a hunched over back, and seemed incredibly disfigured. It just gave me a quick glance, and very quickly moved to the opposite end of the road, where it disappeared behind a tree. The whole thing was just freaky looking. I have never seen an animal that looked anything like that before. I started honking my horn, feeling a bit nervous, wanting my friend to hurry up already. Another maybe minute or two goes by, and he comes out with a stupid, smug expression. He gets in the car and asks me, "What's wrong? You scared of the dark?" And I could tell he's high as a kite. I can't stand the smell of cannabis, and I don't like being around him when he's high. But whatever, it is what it is. I told him no. I just seen this weird dog that I'd never seen before, and it freaked me out. He just starts busting up laughing, thinking I'm joking around, trying to be scary. I ignored him and drove back to our house. I never did see that thing again, even though, as time went on in college, I took him back there more and more times. What I saw, I guess I'll never know for sure. Story 7. Tracks of a Beast. Back in my 20s, I lived in Montana for about 6 years with a couple friends of mine. The entire back portion of the house I lived at was beautiful forest, and in the wintertime, when we would get feet of snow, it was this amazing winter wonderland to walk through. I would spend hours going through and hiking through the snow. I loved it, especially when the sun would come out and it was warm and sunny. Winter warm and sunny, and the sun would just glisten softly off the snow. Even though you're trying to trudge through 2 or 3 feet of snow where we were at, it was very enjoyable. There were areas that I explored that got far less snow than where we were at, which was roughly around 3 or 4 feet of snow, easily. Some areas that I explored that were a little bit closer to a rocky wall was probably closer to 6 inches. Much less snow, I think, in part, due to the coverage of the foliage that was now dead. That is where I saw the largest tracks I've ever seen before. They were without a doubt canine, and I believe there are wolves up here and around here. But I'm fairly certain wolves don't get anywhere near this size. The paw print that I saw was very much a wolf or a canine to some type, except the print was easily more than 8 inches wide and over 9 to 10 inches in length. A massive, massive hulking paw. Either that, or there is some sort of crazy alpha wolf walking around. The other strange thing I noticed was, even though there was a few set of tracks, they were both bipedally patterned. Wolves, naturally, are quadrupedal animals. They walk on all fours. These were steps like a person would take, and the stride between each print was more than 3 feet, which means that whatever made these was walking on 2 legs, and had to have been a very heavy, massive animal. I've never heard of upright walking wolves, at least in the state of Montana, but it's something that I found very interesting, even though I never got to lay eyes on the magnificent animal that made those tracks, but maybe it's probably a good thing that I did not get the chance to. Story 8. The Spirit and the Dogman. This story takes me back to the early 80s, when I was a teenager, and my parents and I lived in this house in question when I was about 9, all the way till I left for college, shortly after 18. What is that? Roughly 9 years. Things of this nature didn't start happening till I was probably closer to 12 or 13, just on the brink of puberty. I don't remember any exact dates of when things began and when things ended, but as soon as I moved out for college, things seemed to die down. Both my parents recognized that something was up with the house almost immediately after moving in. I guess the last tenant, an older woman, had had a heart attack in her sleep and died in the house. We ended up purchasing the house maybe 4 or 5 months after she had passed. She was a widow that lived alone for a very long time. This is just setting up the story for you, so you can understand all the important details I'm about to tell you. Now, this was kind of an old ranch-style house. If you know anything about ranch-style houses, it's when you open the front door, you are immediately greeted by a set of stairs. To your right, one that goes downstairs. To the right of that would be a bedroom. Directly in front of you, a bathroom. And to the left, the garage. Going back up the stairs, facing the front door, turning to your right goes up the stairs, where to your left is the living room. Off to the right of that is the kitchen. And at the top of the stairs, to your right, is a hallway with bedrooms and a bathroom. That's a pretty basic layout. If you want to know more about the inside of a ranch-style home, just simply get on Google. My bedroom was on the bottom, the only bedroom down there, across from the garage where my dad kept his 2 cars. My parents' room was directly above mine, and my little brother's room was across the hallway from theirs. There were only 3 bedrooms. Well, I guess my room was considered a family room. But being a teenager and being the oldest, I got the cream of the crop of picking, which means that I got a huge bedroom, which I said, initially intended to be the family room, but my parents gave it to me anyway. Even though my room was more like a basement in a way, because I had those tiny windows set in on the walls at the top, near the ceiling, just like a basement has, to the back of the house and on the front, so I could see both if I were to look out. Not long after having moved in, my parents began to notice strange things going on in the house. Feelings like you're not alone, the hair raising up on your arms, doors being open, things creaking, which they initially suspected it was just an older house. But things kept turning more and more strange by the minute. They would see objects move across the floor. Things end up being in one place and then put in another. Just stuff like that. However, I feel that whatever this entity was targeted me, and, most importantly, brought along a special friend, which I'll get to that in just a moment. Bear with me. Almost nightly, soon after we moved in, I think it wasn't until the fall, though, personally, until I began experiencing these things by myself. We had moved in at the very beginning of May, and I want to say I began experiencing these things probably end of September, early October. I think the leaves were starting to change. Anyway, at night, I would be visited by this black shadow that had the silhouette of kind of an old lady. The eyes, though, were kind of a glowing white. It would say stuff to me, in a language I didn't quite understand. I wasn't exactly frightened, even though I should have been. She would just appear in the center of my room, staring directly at me, and every time it would always wake me up from a deep sleep. And before she would show up, I would feel her presence coming down the stairs, coming into the room. It was a very, very heavy presence. Not necessarily ominous or evil, like you are probably picturing. It's really hard for me to put into words. But all I can say is that I knew every time that she was coming into my room. After she would show up, she would sometimes stay for up to an hour. Other times, she would only stay there for maybe 10-15 minutes. She would just appear, never moving. I don't know if she was manifesting herself for a reason, but whatever it was, the feeling I got is that she was trying to warn me of something, tell me. Her demeanor wasn't that to hurt me or haunt me, like many think when I tell them this story. It was just a warning message, but I could never understand because the language she spoke, I had never heard anything like it. Maybe it wasn't even a human language. It just sounded gibberish, and what she said to me was almost telepathic. I know this might be sounding crazy, but I'm trying to relay to you exactly what I remember from my experiences. After she would disappear, her friend would always show up, exactly on time, every single time. This creature, a wolf man, a werewolf, a dogman, whatever you want to call it, half man, half wolf, would always show up right after she left and look into my window from the back side of the house. It came up from the woods and would just hang out, bang on the walls, and circle the house. Then it would usually come around the front and stare in, sometimes jiggling the door handle on the front door to almost test if it was properly locked. Sometimes I would hear it jiggle the windows. Whatever it was trying to get in the house. Except I know what it was. I saw it too many times. Unlike the apparition that I saw, this wolf-like man creature was completely terrifying. Part of me wonders if that's what this entity or ghost or spirit, whatever you want to call it, was warning me about. But I have no idea on the correlation between this thing showing up, disappearing, and then this werewolf-like creature coming to pay a visit. There was never a time that I could ever remember where the apparition showed up, disappeared, and the werewolf dogman thing never showed up. It was almost like clockwork, like her or it manifesting itself always brought upon the attention and alertness of that thing. I had already seen movies like American Werewolf in London, The Howling, Silver Bullet. I had a pretty good idea of what werewolves looked like, at least in the movies. And this thing, in my opinion, was freakier looking and far more realistic than you could ever imagine. It wasn't CGI. It wasn't animatronics or somebody in a suit. This was something else entirely. I cannot put enough emphasis on how badly this wolf thing scared me. And every time it would look in the window and down at me, the look on its face was always happy and thrilled, like it had trapped me and it couldn't wait to get into the house and get to me. I was usually terrified, crying, wetting my bed, although I couldn't tell my parents. I was scared to run up the stairs and feared this thing would break in and grab me. Sometimes, after the apparition disappeared, I would hear it on and off throughout the rest of the night, and spent many of those nights falling in and out of sleep due to fear and exhaustion. This even went on all throughout the school year into the summertime, which made my schoolwork much, much harder, and my own personal life a struggle. My parents, well, they never knew of the wolf thing, or of the entity. For some reason, I never thought to tell them, or decided against it. one of the two. But they knew there was something in the house. But they were pretty anti-religious to begin with, or anti-anything supernatural. So I probably figured at the time it was best not to try and convince them of stuff that was happening. My little brother, God rest his soul, who passed away not too many years ago, he had no knowledge of any of this. I wasn't going to scar his young mind. As I had stated previously, this entire phenomenon had gone on until I was 18 and moved out permanently for college. But before I end my story, I have a little interesting anecdote to add. I want to say I was probably 15 or 16. The presence, none of the stuff stopped in the house. I was still getting visits. Not every night. There was no pattern. It was random. Sometimes I would see this apparition nightly for a couple nights. Then I wouldn't see it again for months. Sometimes it would show up every 5 days or weeks. Again, it was completely random intervals. Sometimes, I think the most, was probably about 3 months. But I very much remember my sophomore year of high school, I want to say. I befriended this kid that I didn't know it at the time, but his parents were pretty heavy into Wicca, occultism, and magic. To what extent, I never inquired to find out, but I know that's his background. I didn't know it at the time, but the point is that he was around it, so he should be unfazed by these kinds of things, right? I would later find out that his parents would summon and talk to spirits and do all sorts of crazy, creepy things. Again, I didn't know it at this time, but I had invited him over to my house. He came over, and I'll never forget. He took one step in the door, looked right at me, and he said, "There's something evil in this house. A dark energy surrounding this entire place. I can't be here." Then he turned around, just like that, and left. My parents, I'll never forget as well, were wondering why he had left. He was supposed to stay for dinner, but I just told them that he wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. After that, at school, he kind of avoided me, refused to talk to me, so I kind of gave up on that. We ended up going to the same college and rekindled along the way, which is when I later found out about all the stuff that his parents were into, and that's how he knew that there was something in my house, something far worse than he or his parents have ever dealt with. Now, I don't know if that means the entity that was there, or the Dogman creature that would come to the house. I don't know, and I did not ask him about it at all. Shortly after I finished college, got my bachelor's degree, my brother, also old enough now, graduated high school and himself left for college. Shortly after my brother moved out, it was just my parents living there, and since it was just now them two, they didn't need a 3-bedroom house, so they downgraded. They sold it and ended up moving to a much smaller house, back closer to the city. I guess there must just be something about that house, because the gentleman whom my parents sold it to was an older man whom they had known for years and years. Not a family friend, more a family acquaintance. He was looking for a larger house for him, and, well, they struck a good deal. He purchased it, and get this, within 6 months of him buying it, he had a heart attack in the house and died. I don't really know what happened to the house afterwards. It makes me shudder to think about. Did he see the same apparition I did? Did he experience the same ghastly, ghostly things, the hauntings all around the house? Or did he see that wolf-like creature that stalked the property, trying to break into the house, the windows, looking through every door and crevice it could, wanting to get in? Believe me, as much as I want this whole thing, this entire experience, my life upbringing, to be some made-up Stephen King ripoff, It's unfortunately the cards I was dealt, and is a part of my past that I will never and can never forget. Story 9. Shot to the Eye. Within the last 3 months, my wife, needing more companions of the furry variety, ended up purchasing a rabbit. Well, what she didn't know is that it was pregnant, I guess, because it soon gave birth without us knowing. We saw it making a nest in its hutch, and we knew once it had given birth to a litter that, well, we were now grandparents. We tried and take care of the babies as much as we could help, while also dealing with everyday life and work. We kept the rabbit hutch inside to further regulate the temperature of the babies and to make sure they were getting enough milk. But somewhere along the way, as the time went on, they began dying. I'm not exactly sure if they got sick or what, but it seemed to be an accelerating process. 1 died, then 2, then 3, and that became 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way till 10. All babies of the entire litter had passed in just 60 days of time. While my wife and I were very saddened by their passing, we weren't sure exactly why they died, not planning to keep any of them for our own, but actually rehome them because we weren't looking to keep a community of rabbits. In fact, my wife had no knowledge of it being pregnant, and we weren't sure what to do once we found out it had babies. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise, in a morbid way. Now, here is where I made a huge mistake. Since we kind of live out and about, not close to town, I just figured the wild animals would take care of the dead bunnies, right? So what I should have done was every time a dead baby died, just threw it in the trash. But instead, I took the dead bunnies and just chucked them out to the yard. Figured a stray cat, or maybe a bobcat, or heck, even a coyote would come and find it and gobble it up. After all, baby bunnies aren't exactly big. But what happened is, my guess, it attracted something much, much worse. After each of them died, I would just throw them out in the backyard, as far as I could chuck them, which, again, I know sounds kind of morbid, but I just wanted to dispose of them. In hindsight, maybe I should have just buried them, but whatever. It is what it is at this point. Well, not long after the 10th one was dead and was thrown out there, we began to start hearing sounds of something moving, sniffing, and grunting on the outside of the house. It sounded like a big animal. Maybe a bear, I thought. I was beginning to get nervous, because now this thing became a nightly occurrence, probably searching for food. And then I began to wonder, was throwing the dead bunnies out there that big of a deal? Did I somehow attract a large predator, like a mountain lion, or hell, maybe even a bear? All I had for weapons, which, keep in mind, I'm no weapons expert, and I certainly don't aim to get the most powerful handgun there is, but I feel like my trusty Glock 17 could handle most situations that I might find myself in quite well, like an intruder, or in this case, shooting out the eyeball of a horrendous werewolf-looking creature. As the nights wore on, whatever animal this was started to become more and more aggressive. The first few nights, it started off as shuffling, sniffing, moving alongside the house, acting very restless. I refused to engage because, well, I didn't want to make matters worse. I figured if it was the dead bunnies that attracted it, it would realize there are no more, and would hopefully wander off. But after around night 4, it took a turn for the worst, and began to act far more aggressive. That's when it began banging at the windows, and I saw it for the first time. This thing looked like something you'd see out of a horror movie, trying to break into my house, trying to break the windows, and acting very angry, damaging the house, punching the siding, scraping, clawing, making all sorts of racket, scaring my wife and my animals to death. I wasn't having any of it. I got my Glock ready. This thing came around to the front door, and as it did, I opened it, aimed right at its face, and fired, all in some crazy act of bravery that I myself can't believe I did. I must have aimed perfect, because I took out its left eyeball. Blood splattered, and it let out the most horrendous scream I think I've ever heard in any movie or real life. It retreated off into the darkness, continuing to scream and scream until I couldn't hear it anymore. Well, this was probably roughly a few weeks back. I've been alert and on the ready, code red, in case this thing comes back. But I haven't seen it since, and every night I stay up, keeping my trusty pistol on my side, just in case it does decide to come back. Story 10. Cover Blown. Back in the summertime, me and a few of my closest buddies decide to move from fishing and looking to catch things from the creek to a much smaller lake nearby, in which the creek fed into. We got on the small boat, which was equipped with a very nice spotlight, so we could implore some nighttime fishing, looking for yellow perch and smallmouth bass. I'll spare you all the boring details, because I know you probably just want me to go ahead and get to the really good stuff. Well, we had been out there for a couple of hours. Everything was pretty normal. Nobody was drinking. We were just having a good time, cutting up, laughing, enjoying each other's company, enjoying the amazing summer night air. When we heard noise in the woods, my friend noticed it at first and told us all to shh. When we all drew our attention over to where the noise was coming from, we all heard it. Whatever it was sounded bigger than a person. It was loud. Not quite a crashing sound, like whatever it was being careless. It was just trying to move through the brush. And in this spot, the brush and trees were very, very dense, meaning to even move around, you had to kind of break branches and move stuff around to even move. My buddy shined the spotlight over, and all of our jaws dropped at what we saw. Now, this is coming from me personally, of what I believe. I believe that night, we saw a living, breathing werewolf, or some sort of humanoid wolf thing, because that's exactly what it looked like, standing at least 9 or 10 feet tall, very slender, a long bushy tail, hocks and feet, just like a dog, and even hunched over. It looked like a large wolf, except was standing on 2 legs, bent over, tongue out of its mouth, but had a very angry expression on its face. It was also ripped too, muscles all down its stomach and legs, like this thing was athletic and had a lot of strength. As soon as we shone the spotlight onto it, it immediately perked up, looked right in our direction, where its eyes were lit up by the spotlight. My one friend screamed, while the other pointed and yelled out, "Werewolf!" Then, the thing we were looking at did something neither of us would ever expect it to. While keeping eye contact and staring in our direction, it went full athletic swimmer, and like a human, dove into the lake at incredible speeds and lengths. That's when we could see and hear it swimming towards the boat. We all lost it and began paddling and trying to get the boat back to shore on the other end. For whatever reason, I don't know why my buddy didn't think to start the engine, but we were just losing it. We somehow, in our craze and panic, made it to the other side of the shore, jumped out of the boat, leaving all of our fishing gear, all of our lines, everything in the boat, and ran. My buddy literally runs up to his truck and just unhinges his boat trailer. We all jump in his truck, and he says screw it I'll come back for all this stuff in the morning. Our lives are more important. We jump in, and we're gone. I didn't know if this thing was a werewolf or not, but it scared the living hell out of all three of us. Neither of us have ever gone back to that lake to fish again. We kind of just stick by the little area that we used to go fishing at. But I can tell you one thing about that night. We learned that not only are werewolves real, but they're pretty good swimmers too. And had we stayed there in that spot and not moved, I think it would have come up to our boat, got either on the boat or capsized us, and taken each one of us for a separate meal. If you or somebody you know has a story or encounter you would like to share with me or have me read on this channel, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. The email can be found in the description below. Something I will never forget was when my family and I had taken a long road trip, and all of us, except my husband, whose turn it was to drive, had taken a nap. At least I thought we all had. My husband and I were in front of our minivan, and we had 3 kids and my grandmother in the back. The youngest 2 were directly behind in the middle seats. As I woke up from my nap, I turned myself around. 3 of the kids and grandma were all out. My very youngest, who was right behind me, however, was wide awake. I asked, "Why didn't you fall asleep?" She told me that she hadn't, and was too busy watching the dog. This was pretty surprising, as this particular child wasn't prone to making stuff up or having the best imagination. "What dog was that?" I had asked. "The big dog, like Dad." Now this was getting even more bizarre. "You saw a dog as big as Daddy? Wow. I bet he liked to eat a lot of kibble," I joked, wondering if she'd seen a moose or something. "Well," she told me, "he was really tall and had a body like Daddy, but had a head like Desi. Desi is our neighbor's dog back home. He's a German Shepherd, a rather large one too." She kept talking about how this tall dog-like man that had apparently ran alongside the car for a few moments, staring in at her. I wondered how on earth my husband had not noticed. He swore he hadn't seen anything out of the side windows or mirrors. Any other child, I would have put it down to a dream, or maybe a vivid imagination, but not this kid. When we reached the motel for the night, I got onto the Wi-Fi and Googled up Dogman. I don't know what I thought might find, but it was unbelievable what came up with tons of results. I was scrolling through the images, and she came up behind me and squealed. She said, "See, Mama? Body like a dog, and Desi's head." We never ever discussed this creature. Until that moment, I didn't even know there was such a thing. And when I clicked on Dogman Encounters in Ohio, wouldn't you know, there were tons of them. I had a scary encounter a few months ago, and to be honest, I am lucky I am still here to tell the tale. I was driving home after a long day at work, and I just wanted to hit the shower and grab a beer. I wasn't driving overly fast, thank God. It isn't unusual for a deer to jump out in front of you on the roads that I ride on, so you need to have your wits about you. This particular night, thank holy hell I was concentrating, as not only did one deer jump out at me, but it seemed like a whole herd, and they kept coming from all directions. A couple actually ran blindly into the car and seemed to stun themselves before jumping off again fast, but they weren't even fazed. Like, the fact they hit the car didn't even matter. They were intent on getting away from something. I sat there in the car, not daring to even attempt to move. Something had apparently spooked them very bad. They were almost kamikaze. And then I saw why. Something was indeed chasing them, and that something was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was huge, standing upright on 2 feet like a person would. In fact, the whole body was person-like, except covered in weird gray-brown fur. The arms were shaped like a human too, just hairy. Although it was moving quite fast, chasing the deer, it appeared to be slightly hunched and had a weird hump at the top of its back, near the neck. And then there was the head. I don't really know what I expected to be at the top of that tall, hairy body, but it wasn't what I saw, that's for sure. This thing had a head like a dog, or more so a hyena. The real sort of roundish black snout, and the rounded ears, small black beady eyes, and a weird spiky sort of hair going down its neck. I was looking at a two-legged man-sized hyena. It took absolutely no notice of me, or the car whatsoever. It was clearly too caught up in chasing the deer. That thing looked very strong and well-fed. It did not appear to be starving or bony or scrawny. I sat there for a few more moments, waiting to see if there was any more commotion. I don't think I was scared, more in shock, or maybe even in awe of what I'd just seen. When I was certain it was all over, I drove off. Once I'd gotten home, I realized how lucky I had been. If I'd been going much faster, then I would have plowed into all those deer, and maybe even this hyena man. I probably would have wiped a ton of them out and crashed the car. It just shows you how you got to be careful while driving in deer country. You never know what is going to run out in front of you. While camping with several of my close friends, we got the horrible idea of scaring the crap out of the jumpiest one of us in the group. For the sake of this story, we'll call him Steve. We had the cruelty to pull it off, but not the innovation. We came up with the idea of one of us getting sprayed with as much ketchup as we could spare, and then, at the right moment, come running out of the woods, looking like a blood-soaked maniac, or a victim of a maniac, whichever the actor decided would be best to play. We were a bunch of snickering idiots over it, from the moment of conception, and we had to wait from morning clear until evening before we would ever have our chance. We were a bunch of college goons, and apparently, Steve had been that one kid that always truly wanted to fit in, but never could all his life. So here he was, carrying that role into adulthood, which made him an easy target. The stray dog that will get beat up if it means getting a crumb of attention. It said as much about him as it did about us. We did everything we could to properly set up the atmosphere. We got a good campfire going. We agreed to always act paranoid but not say anything. Always looking over our shoulders, acting like we saw something in those dark woods, by staring for a few extra seconds before coming back to the fire. If anyone asked us what was wrong, we would just shrug it off, slowly building the tension that would eat away at Steve's nerves before we finally pounced. Call it evil, but it was very well orchestrated. It took a minute, but it was starting to work. Steve started flicking glances around, looking over his shoulder at random intervals. Natural sounds like sticks falling out of trees made him jump, just a little too much. I won't lie, unexpected sounds that made us jump too, which gave us ideas to take our cruelty even further. We would pick up rocks and other heavy objects, throw them into the darkness when he wasn't watching. For hours, it seemed like serendipity was on our side. It had been determined that I would be the one that would spray myself with ketchup until one of us could get away from the camp. And then, at an unexpected point, come running back to the campfire screaming. I settled on acting like there was a killer out there, since there is no way they would not recognize me if I pretended to be a killer myself. The tension was building so much in the atmosphere that the guys began looking at me restlessly, impatient for me to go ahead and get to the climax of the whole thing that we had all been waiting for all day long. I couldn't help it. I was waiting for the moment of maximum impact. One of the guys got up to go use the bathroom, so I would definitely have to wait until he got back or he'd miss it. He was taking his time, and even I was beginning to get impatient. I nearly soiled myself when the most nerve-electrocuting scream I had ever heard shattered through the night. Steve jumped up from where he was sitting, flailing at the air like he was trying to swim up to the sky. Our guy, who had gone off to the bathroom, came back, drenched in ketchup, screaming so hard that his speech was unintelligible. As soon as Steve laid eyes on him, he curled up into a ball screaming just as loud. I was both confused and extremely pissed off. Did they think that I was taking too long? Why did he suddenly decide to take my role? Then I absolutely noticed that the ketchup bottle was still next to me, where I was sitting, unopened. In the shadows behind our bloodied friend, there stood something tall and menacing. At first, I thought it was a muscle-bound maniac, but as soon as I saw its glowing eyes and long ears, I knew I was dealing with something entirely different. Its mouth hung open just enough to show long yellow teeth. Covered in gray fur, for some reason, around the forearms and the clawed hands were more glossy than the rest. The thing ignored everybody else in the group and pounced on the guy that I thought was covered in ketchup. He landed face first in the fire. The monster attacking him stood up, pinned him down with one large clawed foot, placing it on his back in the middle of his shoulders. Then, the features were stark, revealed in the light of the fire. It was the head of a black or gray wolf. Although the head was a bit wider than it should have been, as was the chin, its features seemed twisted in expression. One of the guys must have panicked because he grabbed the jug of paint thinner that we were using as lighter fluid for the fire and threw it on this thing, apparently forgetting that our friend was right down there in the fire, needing rescued. The liquid erupted in a fireball that licked the limbs of the trees overhead. When I could see again, this thing was running off in the forest, with its fur on fire. Our friend on the ground went from having his face shoved into the fire to being completely engulfed in fire, and the guy that had thrown the paint thinner in the first place was patting off a fire on his arm from starting the backsplash. The entire thing did not end well. Our friend died of burns. Nobody believed our story, so we were charged with murder. As for Steve, he was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial, and was so shaken up by the whole thing that his sanity caved in. Since my testimony did not stand up in court, the next best thing is to offer it. It's bad enough that my friend died, but I couldn't have the entire world believing that we had killed him.